Did we sing ourselves happy birthday as a starter?
I'm happy to sing. I don't need much of an excuse to inflict that on people.
I'm mostly saying that in jest.
Whether this accords with your plans for boosting the listenership, Frankie, I'm not sure.
I count at least one listener that seems to have enjoyed the little musical interludes in Irwin.
That's true. But we've already got Irwin.
I know.
I feel like Irwin's in the bank.
I know. I also don't know if he's like representative of all the listenership, so the rest of them could just be like, stick to the climate papers, people.
This is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording today on Wurundjeri, and as always, I'm joined by my two co-hosts, Global Vice President of ESG and T-shirts at the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Good evening. Alas, I have less T-shirts spruiking in our future this evening, but
What?
Don't think I've forgotten about it, people.
The T-shirts haven't forgotten about you.
Those dulcet tones are from a man who has recently relearned the folly of typing slabs of prose into a web form, Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
Yes, a cat who is currently sitting angelically in my lap deleted 95% of something I had slaved over for hours and hours and hours. And thanks to LinkedIn's not entirely fully featured article drafting setup, poof, it's gone.
Oh no.
But I've rewritten it. Cats can't hold me back forever.
Yikes. You got to do that in Word.
Yeah. I've learned my lesson.
How many people have suggested that to you now, Tennant?
And every one of them was right.
On this week's show, we discuss a paper that grapples with how we set the social cost of carbon dioxide and whether ethical considerations should play a bigger role. But first, a round of UN climate talks have just wrapped in Bonn in what is being seen by many as a critical curtain raiser for COP28, which will take place in Dubai in December this year. But with much commentary focused on the failure of negotiators to agree an agenda for the talks until they were almost finished, pessimism abounds about the likelihood of substantive progress later this year. Frankie, is the pessimism justified?
So, I mean, I think these kinds of intersessional talks are important for setting the mood. Like, we all know that COPs are as much a political exercise as anything else. So that momentum needs to be built up over the course of the months in advance of the talks themselves. And so, it's not great to hear, that there wasn't kind of clear consensus on an agenda. Some of the issues that arose in the talks in Bonn aren't that surprising to an extent. You saw rich countries want to, keep prosecuting the argument for raising ambition in NDCs and a focus on mitigation efforts. And equally, you saw developing countries want to make sure that climate finance is more firmly on the agenda. And I think having read a little bit of commentary from negotiators that were at that conference, I think there's a lot of lack of trust, if you like. A lot of the richer countries have missed that commitment around delivering the $100 billion in climate finance, and so I think you should continue to expect to see developing countries want to make sure that this is addressed and not kind of let that go as an important agenda item. I think the other dimension to these talks that's interesting to look at is the transition in the presidency from the previous COP to the next COP. And obviously the one COP28 being held in the UAE saw this as one of the first opportunities, I think, for the UAE presidency to try and step up and really play a role in setting the agenda and start to put forward some of the issues that, it would like to champion. I think from everything that I read, that was broadly viewed as a bit of a missed opportunity. I think it wasn't seen that they played a role as strongly as perhaps they should have.
Yeah, and the president of COP28, Dr. Sultan Ahmed Al-Jaber, is a figure of controversy in this context at the moment because his day job is to run the UAE National Oil Company. And, of course, he was appointed to that role as something of a reformist, environmentally minded breath of fresh air from his previous gig founding and running the sort of Green City, Green Enterprise Mazda Corporation in UAE. But it strikes a bunch of people, including a bunch of parliamentarians in the EU and Congress people in the United States, as improper for an oil company boss to be running the climate negotiations. And they have recently written to the UNFCCC and to anybody who will listen saying he should not be the president. And saying a bunch of other things as well. That's probably not going to have a direct impact, but the COP28 president did say some words in the course of the fortnight about the political language that was so vexed at COP27, where there was a big fight about going beyond the Glasgow language about phasing down coal to extend that language to all fossil fuels. He's been voicing phasing down unabated fossil fuels, which in the graph of language that people have tried, fossil fuels versus unabated fossil fuels, phase down versus phase out, is, I guess, in what might be thought of as the weakest quadrant, but is a lot stronger than what the UAE and others have been willing to accept previously. So, I don't know, maybe that's progress.
It strikes me that in the context of the debates where they were left in Sharm el-Sheikh last year, the decision to appoint the top state-run oil company executive to the presidency of the COP is a little bit of an own goal. It kind of inflames concerns that were already inevitably there with UAE taking on the COP presidency. I don't claim in any way, shape or form to understand the internal politics or indeed the credentials of this particular individual in any great detail, but certainly the perception is there and is going to be problematic all the way through, and the danger is that it makes what was already a pretty sticky wicket for making progress in Dubai in 6 months' time even more difficult to navigate, right?
I am not an intimate acquaintance of Dr. Sultan Ahmed Al-Jaber, but it seems to me it's a little bit like the equivalent of if Alan Finkel got appointed to run Santos and then got appointed to be president of Australia hosting a COP. You know, some people would go, my God, this fossil executive is the worst thing ever. And some people would go, oh, Alan, he's great. And everybody would disagree with each other very intensely.
The potential you could see in having someone like that is if he did choose to extend the language and push on, the issue that, is the elephant in the room in that sense. So I'd read somewhere that he'd said during the course of the week that a phase down of fossil fuels was inevitable. That I didn't see that in direct quotations or anything, but some people had taken some heart from his comments through the week.
Yeah, I think he said that in some sort of closed room briefing. It was also noted that there wasn't any particular timeline placed on that comment. Someone could say that it is inevitable sometime before the heat death of the universe that fossil fuels will phase down. the exact date that they're phased down by. Pretty important in the current context. But, look, I'm willing to withhold judgment. A lot will depend on how he conducts himself over the course of those 2 weeks and indeed in the lead up that, as we learnt. And Sham, the preparatory work that the president does in the lead up to the talks is really, really important, as well as, the engagement that happens on the ground. So the proof will be in the pudding in terms of how that all plays out. I'm interested in this kind of tension which is continuing between, to massively oversimplify, developed countries trying to ramp up mitigation action and developing countries on board for mitigation, but, you can't expect us to take on more without getting serious about climate finance and ideally not just private capital giving us more loans, but grants and some form of reparations for damage already done and to be done. Is there the making in here of some sort of grand bargain, or am I being too optimistic?
So it's always been the case, I think, that these COPs only make progress when there is something, a step forward on finance and a step forward on mitigation. They do have to go together. How much of a step forward there's going to be this year, I don't know. But a big part of the point of this COP is to complete the global stocktake of how have all the first round of Paris pledges and upgrades gone, where's everybody at, how are we on track to the Paris goals. And of course we're going to find that we're not on track to the Paris goals. But how are people going to respond to that is the question mark. The Paris process envisages a virtuous cycle of countries pledging what they think they can do, observing how they and others are going, and lifting their pledges and their actions as trust in themselves and others increases. And so far I think that's going okay, but we're certainly not on track to 1.5 degrees. So I think the finance piece and the ambition piece absolutely go together. I do have some extremely predictable, maybe, thoughts on what countries can do to make good on the pledge to finance decarbonisation in developing countries. Mm-hmm. And that is to create markets where clean investments are more profitable investments.
Yep.
The US is trying to have a go at that with not with IRA, although IRA does that within the US, but with their clean metals agreement that they're still cooking up with the European Union. European Union's doing it with CBAM. That's not how they describe it often, but CBAM will make it more profitable to supply clean products into the European market, and those investments could be anywhere. They might actually go faster and harder outside Europe with a laxer regulatory environment on other matters than they do within. So,
is there any problem the CBAM can't solve, Tennant? That's the question.
I don't think it's got much either way on tooth decay, but let me think about that one a little longer.
Come back to us.
Next fortnight, how CBAM will solve the world's tooth decay issues.
Shall we chat about a report?
We should, but before we do that...
What?
I know. And I'm not going to shirt Frank you, don't worry. I declared that up front.
You are shirt fronting me, but maybe not with T-shirts.
In the friendliest way. Because it's our birthday, guys. Since we published the last episode and before this one comes out, we will have been in the ears of our delightful Summerupperers for a year. So we ticked over a year. So happy birthday to us and to you guys.
Hooray!
This is all of a sudden seeming very self-serving.
Yeah, I know. But in all seriousness, I did post about it on LinkedIn, including pictures of cake and
yes.
our workshop nerdy efforts in celebration. And I thought it was just useful to say also on the pod that when we were reflecting on like why we started this crazy adventure a little over a year ago, a lot of that was because we wanted to create this sort of supportive space for climate professionals out there that, you know, put a lot of themselves into work. They have a lot of passion on the issue. A lot of us can't help talking about this outside of our day jobs, hence why the three of us needed to start a podcast. And it's just been genuinely delightful to have those interactions with listeners since we've been doing this.
I delight in, apart from hanging out with you two lovely nerds every couple of weeks, the random sort of approaches that I get of people that say they really enjoy the podcast. And it's a lovely way of meeting people and connecting with folk that I wouldn't otherwise. And I always enjoy those interactions, and I'm delighted that you're getting something out of it as well.
Yeah. If a podcast drops in the woods and nobody's there to hear it, does it make a sound? I think without our Summerupperers, we are nothing. So here's to you. Here's to you.
If anyone doubted our nerd credentials, the fact that we celebrated our birthday with a strategy workshop.
On brand. On brand.
Very on brand for us.
What do we do now? We chat about a report, right?
I think that's the whole concept.
That's our formula. Winning.
Discount rates play a central role in efforts to weigh the costs and benefits of emissions reduction policies. The social cost of carbon, a dollar figure that is meant to represent the economic cost of each additional tonne of carbon emitted, can vary wildly depending on the discount rate applied, with big implications for the types of policies it seems reasonable for governments to pursue. Now, this alone makes how discount rates are set a controversial topic. But there's more. Discount rates facilitate a calculation of the present value of future damages caused by carbon emissions, so those damages can be weighed against the current costs of climate action. This means that unless the discount rate is set at zero, it results in weighing the welfare of the current generation higher than future generations, a position that some regard as inherently unethical. It is all a bit of a mess which is waded into with gusto in a brand new paper from the Centre on Global Energy Policy entitled Discounting the Distant Future, a critique of the EPA's analysis of the social cost of carbon. In it, the authors use the US Environmental Protection Agency's recently updated estimate of the social cost of carbon as a jumping-off point on all of the above, and Tennant, they even venture some thoughts on a pathway forward. What did you make of it?
So I thought that this paper was like a small serving but very dense and chewy, like the best kind of brownie.
Did you feel a little bit sick after you ate it?
No, but I felt like that was enough, and I didn't want to read another one like that for just another week or so.
Well, maybe it's time for a little nap.
That's right, but a very thoughtful nap. So I thought this was a great paper from the people at Columbia. We do use discount rates all the time in a whole range of policy processes and climate processes in particular, for new regulations and laws, for new major projects, and for thinking about climate change costs and benefits themselves. And so in this paper, the authors, they just give a really helpful survey on the ways that people have thought about discount rates generally and in the climate context. And they're doing this in the context of the US EPA updating its approach to doing discounting, and the White House also updating its broader stance on regulation. There's a requirement in US policymaking to do these kinds of cost-benefit analyses, and there's a whole literature to support that. So broadly what they do here is look at the approaches that have been taken, consider the critiques of all the approaches, and leave us with, well, what do you do given that there's problems with everything? And they think that the EPA has missed an opportunity to move the debate forward and take advantage of some of the thinking that's going on. But broadly, I think we should first start with, like, what are the approaches to discounts? And basically there's the descriptive approach and the ethical judgment approach. The descriptive approach has been the most common approach to deriving discount rates in US policymaking, at least, and it purports to be a value-neutral, we'll just look at what the market actually does, what the discount rates embodied in commercial interest rates, market interest rates are, because we don't want to be, as policymakers, deciding something that actually there's a revealed preference out there in the market for. They say, look, we're getting these values from what happens out there in the market, which is pricing all kinds of things. It's pricing all kinds of assets. It is considering the different values that those assets will have over time. Let's just use that. There are some problems here, but that's descriptivism. What's ethics? What's ethics, Precious?
A lot of the reason, I think, for having a focus the other way on ethics arises when you talk about the shortfalls of the descriptive method. But suffice to say that it's insufficient to grapple with what are inherently ethical issues that are raised when you're trying to value costs and benefits really far into the future, which is very much at the heart of long-term policies focused on climate change, because climate change plays out, over centuries. And so it calls into question the idea of how you deal with the preferences, the living conditions and situations of people who are not alive yet. And the fact of putting a number to that's greater than zero. If you have a discount rate that's higher than zero, you are effectively valuing the lives of people who aren't here yet less than current generations. I think the majority of economists that have looked and sort of written papers on the issue would say that the descriptive method can't in and of itself address those concerns. It's oversimplified and unrealistic and also conceptually invalid, some people would say.
The descriptive rate picks something that's out there in the world and can be pointed to and feels like it's it's grounded in reality, and then applies it to a problem to which it seems largely unsuited.
Yeah.
Basing your discount rate for long run climate impacts on the emergent preferences of share markets over a period of time which share markets operate, which is necessarily the next several decades at most, and often thinking in a much more short-term way, is inherently problematic. And as you say, Frankie, the values that are emergent in those markets reflect the preferences of the current generation. They, by their very nature, can't reflect the preferences of those future generations. It's interesting, this paper sort of steps through the problems with the descriptive approach, but I don't know that it's completely on board with the ethical approach either. It's almost like it's trying to problematize both and kind of find a pathway forward that kind of integrates the best thinking on both sides.
It's not, and that's because none of this is simple. Like if it was easy, and I think I saw one great quote. I think it was from a Dasgupta paper that talked about intergenerational welfare economics that raises more questions than it's able to answer, which I felt a little bit like what reading this paper did to me, even though it was only 10 pages. So if you're thinking about the way that you would go about discounting, say, with making it explicit ethical judgments. The alternative that's put forward to taking a purely descriptive approach, which I still think we should unpack a little bit more, is this idea of discounting with like explicit ethical judgments. So you consider a benign, like a social planner, someone who's this hypothetical decision maker for a society, and their preferences reflect kind of the considered objectives across a whole society, and particularly with respect to time. And there are, I guess, a few considerations that you need to think about there. One is around social impatience. So the question, which I think is grappled with more in more detail in this paper than the others, which is, should current generations get more weight than future ones? And unpack that a little further. And it talks about the how you assign value around that through a pure rate of social time preference, where, in this kind of mode of doing it, each generation gets their assigned value for well-being, which depends on, the goods and services it consumes, and then a weight that depends on their distance from the present. So you get these weighted averages of generations summed up to produce a measure of kind of total intergenerational well-being. And the scholars who pursue their ethical approach to discounting frequently argue that value should be zero or near zero. But then it raises questions around, well, practically, what are the limitations or the issues in doing that?
And they're pretty serious.
They absolutely are. So even though you have all these, eminent scholars who advocate the fact that we shouldn't be, valuing future generations any less than current ones, including Lord Nicholas Stern, who said straying from that, like a near zero value for pure rate of social time preference, is not a position that has much foundation in ethics, and many would find unacceptable. But I get one of the obvious kind of implications of applying, say, a value of zero in a policy like that would mean that to maximise wealth across generations, you're asking current generations to impoverish themselves so that future generations can be a bit wealthier. And you could sort of take that rationale even further by suggesting that, sort of each generation, one after the other, impoverishes themselves a little more, and no one's better off. And I think someone put it that it's the paradox of the indefinitely postponed splurge, where no one lives to see a generation that's better off. So hence why it raises a lot more questions. And when you get down to the fact that these kinds of analyses have to happen, the practical considerations and sort of the prevailing view of a lot of economists that look at this say that having a value of zero here is not really workable because of what it's asking of people. It goes much further than what they would contend most people think is reasonable.
This section made me think a lot about cathedrals. Like cathedrals, they're in the discourse quite often these days. People casting aspersions on modern society for being so short-termist, and think back to European cathedrals that were designed by people who must have known that they could not possibly be completed in their own lifetimes, and they were intergenerational works that continue to provide satisfaction and beauty centuries later. And isn't that amazing? And a zero or a near zero discount rate would imply that we should be doing a lot more stuff like cathedrals, things that are very huge investments to make and have a long-term payoff to an awful lot of people into the future. But a zero rate implies that you should be doing almost nothing but cathedrals, that everybody today should be wearing double-patched hand-me-down clothes while they devote all of their resources to investment for the benefit of the future. And the next generation will do the same, and the next generation after, until, I don't know, we're like a solar system Dyson sphere of nothing but cathedrals, which, I don't know, might appeal to Freeman Dyson, but it doesn't appeal to me. So having a right to say, at a point in time, I'm going to enjoy something and consume something seems very reasonable, but how do you fit that into an ethical model? Or how do you fit an ethical model around that?
So a planet populated only by cathedrals and folk wandering around in heavily patched clothes doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense. But at the other end of the spectrum, and for this I have to explain that Tennant reminded me in the course of preparing for this episode that the Garner Review actually spent a bit of time on this, and because the paper was only 10 pages, I got to go and have a dip into that.
Bonus content.
Which was super fun. Really interesting reflection on this whole space. So commend it to you. It's relatively early in Garner. If you search for pure time preference in the Garner Review 2008 edition, it will come up just like that. Garner quotes DeLong, who points out that a rate of pure time preference of 3% means that somebody born in 1995 counts for twice as much as somebody born in 2020, which is also ridiculous, right? And so I think that underlines how untenable both of these purist positions are. I will also say, though, it sounds a lot like a debate in a undergraduate economics tutorial.
Infinite cathedrals versus grandkids in the meatgrinder.
Exactly, right? There was one critique of this paper. And I suppose, no, wait a second. We need to talk a little bit about their proposed resolution of this.
What? I think you're looking a gift horse in the mouth here, Luke.
But before we dive into the solution space, which I have to say was maybe the bit of this paper that disappointed a little because it was pretty light on detail.
Yes.
And we'll get to that. And why does it seem to be that in so many papers we read the answer is to survey a bunch of people? But anyway, just putting a little pin in that.
Feel opinions redux.
Yeah. It does feel like we're drawn into
not just a bunch of people, a bunch of economists, Frankie. We'll survey a bunch of economists and we'll base our approach to solving the climate crisis to the median view of those economists. And not only that, but we're just going to assume that everyone's going to be cool with it.
I want to stick a pin in that.
Sorry, spoiler.
Yeah, I want to stick a pin in that for a minute because I feel like we skipped over a little bit of the detail and, why there are issues with descriptive models. But I also wanted to point out that I think this paper makes a really good point, especially in a US context, let alone anywhere else, that governments prefer to probably avoid the idea that their analyses are influenced by ethical judgments because they're going to be really highly scrutinized and in countries like the US litigated fairly heavily. So it's far easier for governments to point to empirical data where it exists, no matter how irrelevant and not up to the task it is for the problem it's trying to solve, than weigh into this stuff. And I loved that they included a quote from. I mean, this paper was full of really great quotes from both economists but also philosophers. Michael Sandel cautions that this appeal of markets is that they seem to spare us the need for messy, contentious debates about how to value things, and that in the end is a false promise that by banishing, morally contested questions from public debate doesn't leave those things undecided. It simply means that markets will decide these questions for us.
On the Michael Sandel point, it is true that ethical decisions don't go away just because you pretend not to be making them or you contract them out. But I do think that there is actually a substantial practical and even theoretical benefit to pushing decisions away and into a marketplace, as long as the market has actually got some decent functional rules and regulations underpinning it, because it is hard for governments to explicitly be the ones to decide some stuff. And when something is seen to be in the zone of decision, somebody does this to me rather than, this is just one of those things that happens. It's just the way the economy works. It can be hard for things to happen at all. And a very great deal of things do need to happen. So pushing things out to the market can serve a somewhat not very praiseworthy arse-covering function, but it can also serve just get things done without having 25 years of debate about it first, which can sound quite attractive.
Yeah, look, and I agree with all that, but I guess the other thing to say here as well, I mean, the reason this is obviously super important in the context of climate change is because of the timescale over which the impacts of climate change will happen. But this conversation around discount rates and cost-benefit analyses comes up in so many other areas of public policy where there is an expectation of government to make decisions based on the welfare of either people who aren't here yet or need to be, the welfare of people into the future. And that's just sort of one aspect of it. We're also talking about lenses over equality as well, who's going to have access to more resources versus less. And that is the role of governments, and it speaks to, as they point out in the paper, the reason we have progressive tax systems and social welfare nets as well. I feel like in some senses the debates around where you set thresholds on progressive tax systems and stuff tends to be a lot simpler, even though some of the same considerations are involved in terms of the government making a judgment over how this is going to impact people into the future or not.
Because, whatever the relative power of the folk that are being impacted by those decisions, they're all present. And so there is at least the possibility that they or someone representing them can advocate on their behalf. And that's the great critique of approaches that seek to heavily discount the utility of future generations, is that they're just not here, and so they can't have that same weight. And so it's the government's responsibility to factor that in, to give as much weight to the well-being of future citizens as current citizens. How realistic that is, and the political pathway to doing that, which is where I kept coming back to. Like, many of these questions aren't questions of economics; they're questions of politics, actually, and a durable consensus that placed a great deal of value on the well-being of future generations isn't going to be won in an economics tutorial or an economics debate in peer-reviewed journals. It's going to be won in the public domain, and it's going to be political actors that are able to build that case and build support for it. There were some interesting reflections in this paper on some ways of thinking about this which could be stepping stones towards building that sort of support. And I think we see some of this in our debate around climate change already, sort of thinking about impacts on your children or your grandchildren or your great-grandchildren, sort of future generations that one can think about in some kind of grounded way, which I think is more relatable for many citizens out there than perhaps some theoretical, esoteric generation some 100, 200, 300 years hence. It's not to say that we should necessarily be less concerned about that generation, but we've also got to consider that we're engaging with human beings, and there is that reality that, you know, if you're connected either by geography or by family or by time to someone, you're likely to be more concerned about them.
I think it was interesting that, again, when we touched earlier on survey redux, that when
Yes.
they referred to a survey of social discounting experts, I liked this line where they're like, you know, even in populations as homogenous as economists that focus on social discounting and write papers about
It's
it.
like, are they subtweeting themselves at that point? I was very confused.
Yeah, me too.
I think they might be. But to give them their due, what they're saying there is that if you look at what a bunch of people think, because we don't all agree about ethical judgments, and, you know, have a look at what people do think, even if that's involving field opinion surveys, you come out with non-zero but rather low discount rates.
Yes.
Yep.
And whatever methodological critiques we might have about surveys, and, you know, the people who know what a discount rate is are inherently unrepresentative, that's probably not an unreasonable place to come to. It's hard to do any of the number crunching that policy demands without putting in a number about a discount rate, and a 0-1 seems to break the system, and a high one seems to produce sociopathic absurdity. Like non-zero but quite low, maybe the golden mean.
Yeah, which was my conclusion out of this paper, which is kind of where I was driving at earlier when I was talking about these polls in the debate, and there is a relatively straightforward place to land, which is that you know, if we don't want to break the model, and I guess we don't. The answer is to have a discount rate, but have it relatively low, and then the argument becomes how low do you have it within this relatively narrow band, which is a conversation I'm happy to leave to the economists. My key concern is when we think about these issues, we don't overestimate the cost of deploying climate-friendly technology and discount the long-term benefits of deploying that technology and then do nothing, because ultimately it's the relative costs that matter in driving government decision making, and we need to think about those two things together. The cost of carbon doesn't exist in some kind of, you know, vacuum chamber. It exists in a context, and it should be supporting us to make good decisions around climate policy. And that is something that we can observe over time. Are we making good decisions? And that reflection is one of the ways that we can perhaps help determine whether we do have that cost of carbon set in the right place. The evidence to date around where the social cost of carbon has been set, let's talk about the US, because this is the focus of this paper, would suggest that perhaps it's been set a bit low.
Yes.
And that perhaps the social cost of carbon being a bit higher wouldn't be a bad thing in terms of driving a bit more appropriate decision making when it comes to climate action, which is, I think, where the Biden administration is heading, right?
Yeah, that's right. And on this point, there's a fun profile in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, which we'll put a link to in the show notes. The Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA, is headed by now by a guy named Richard Revege, who is a deep thinker on cost-benefit analysis. He's been a law professor advising state EPAs that were suing previous national EPA administrators, and he is trying to correct the whole approach to regulatory analysis so that major executive actions and pushes by the EPA on regulating power plants so that they've basically got to do CCS or close in due course, regulating vehicles so that they've got to get cleaner, consistent with something like 2/3 of them being pure EVs by 2035. Anyway, he's a very interesting guy, and there's a fun anecdote about him doing cost-benefit analysis as a child in Argentina about the value of getting out of bed on a school day before he found out whether there'd been a coup, an attempted coup, or a general strike that might lead to school not being on that day. I like that kind of applied economic thinking from an early age.
As long as you don't share this approach with my 9-year-old son, Tennant, I'm totally fine with you geeking out on that.
No, I don't think he needs to worry about coups. Yeah.
I think he would find another event that he would find similarly distasteful to apply that particular calculation to. Do we have much else to say about this?
What was really appealing about reading this paper as well is that it's not as though Australia has been having a deep and thoughtful conversation about this stuff over the last decade. Like, I think it was really great to hear and sort of reflect back that Garno addressed that, but where has this been, in the conversation in Australia in the intervening years? And I remember Tennant doing a shout out to the New South Wales Treasury, I think, for recently having done some work. But given the consequential impact of how you choose to deal with discount rates and climate policy, it feels like something that should be a focus of the Australian government's work on their overarching net zero strategy. It doesn't make a lot of sense that we would take very different approaches to this issue across the country if we're all signed up to the same, commitments around it, reducing emissions. And so I think socialising this conversation more needs to happen in Australia, because honestly, I think if you asked most people who are even working in this space in their day jobs to reflect on like the history of discount rates and how exactly do people arrive at numbers like 3% or 7%, that is wild. That I've come across cost benefit analyses that use that kind of discount rate in this country. I think we need to revisit that and I think have do a version of what the US has done here in Australia.
For reference, Garno landed on a pure time preference of 0.05%, which he notes was similar to the one landed at by the Stern Review just a year before. So very low.
Yeah. And so my final thought is to agree that we do need to have this conversation more. And one place, additionally, where it's potentially going to get really real is that the national energy objectives are being amended to add a climate element to what must be weighed up in determining the best outcome for consumers, the long-term interest of consumers. And that's going to require coming up with some numbers to plug in about that. And you could do that in another version of the descriptive approach, which is just grabbing a number from somewhere else without, maybe filing off the serial numbers a little bit so that you're not too bothered by the fact that the number was prepared for a different reason and doesn't quite mean what you need it to mean in this context. Or it could involve a much more complex argument of the sort that we've been going through. So what is the impact of carbon in the NEO going to be is going to depend in part on our new friend discount rates.
I have a third pathway for you, Tennant. Yeah. We should run a poll of our listeners and ask them what the discount rate should be and then prepare our first Let Me Sum Up submission to that process.
Ooh, I like it.
I wonder if a limbo competition might not be the way to do it, but don't get the economists competing in that one. I don't think they're sufficiently flexible.
As always, we close out the show with one more thing, in which we all share something that is currently captivating our attention. Frankie, what have you got?
Well, I quoted Michael Sandel from this paper that we were just talking about, and over the last few years, I've been trying to work through some of the books that he's written over the years, because I like wonking out on political philosophy in the spare time that I don't have between doing this and raising tiny humans and working. But I just find him incredibly engaging as a presenter. He's a political philosopher. He works out of Harvard University in the US. And so this is a little bit of a PSA for some of his work that's been made freely, publicly accessible. So he runs a course, I think, for first-year philosophy students that steps you through the different political philosophies. I think it's called his Justice course, like Justice, what's the right thing to do. So if you Google that, you can watch a series of, I think they're on YouTube or something, that are really great. Hard recommend. And then in more recent times, he's done a couple of other interesting things, including a few years ago having hosted a special with BBC where he employs his usual manner of engagement. So he's probably one of the best I've seen in demonstrating that sort of Socratic approach to having discussions, where he's got... Well, I mean, you laugh, but...
I'm laughing. I'm laughing because we've just realised we've just created a new corner, which is Philosophy Corner. Because Tenet's one more thing was about a philosopher last week.
Totally here for that.
I'm coming off as very lowbrow. I will need to come up with a similarly erudite one more thing for next week.
Yeah. Get a toga, young.
Right. If you watch the way he works, though, and it's really marvelous, because a lot of the people he's engaging with in the clips that you can watch are students, so they're like there to soak it all up and really lean into to the debate. And so a lot of what he had to say, as well as lamenting the loss of that kind of system of respectful debate as well. So he uses that sort of Socratic approach to pulling in different perspectives. And he did a special with BBC on should the rich world pay for climate change. And he had, I think, 60 people from 30 countries around the world. And this was done, in 2016. So this was pre the advent of Zoom, but it was a kind of probably what was probably best class in the world sort of set up at the time, where he had all these people beaming in from, and it's just really great because he's mostly talking to, I think, would be quite young people studying as students, and they do go to a lot of the issues we talk about on this podcast. Who should bear the biggest cost? What is the role of markets and carbon trading? Is that ethical? So I couldn't recommend a lot of these things more. He's obviously a really deep thinker and has a lot of really useful and relevant things to say for people who are interested in those concepts and how it applies to climate change. So Michael Sandel, I will put a list of links in the show notes.
Sounds fantastic. Tennant, what have you got?
So I was transported with delight to see in my Twitter feed a paper from the London School of Economics and the African Climate Foundation entitled Implications for African Countries of a Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism in the European Union.
This story is starting out so happily.
But I did have a little whisper at the back of my mind saying, but will they look at it well? And dear listener, they did not look at it well. This paper was balls.
Oh dear, I'm so sorry, Tim.
Well, I needed to get my dissatisfaction with this paper out, so I wrote a little piece on LinkedIn, which I'll put a link to in the show notes. But this article is already being cited, not my article, this paper from the LSE is being cited at the WTO and in the discourse to say, oh my God, EU CBAM is going to cost Africa $25 billion a year of lost GDP. And that number is the purest of nonsense for reasons that I go into in some detail, but the first and most important among them being it comes from a scenario that directly contradicts what the EU is actually doing. But the danger of publishing a bunch of scenarios, which people should do, they should have a lot of scenarios, the danger is that people will pluck out the one that sounds most dramatic, even if it has nothing to do with what's actually happening, and just say, and that's the answer. And that indeed is what has happened here. So we can be very confident the impact on Africa of CBAM is not $25 billion a year, but what it is, this work sadly won't tell us.
So it sounds like it's problematic on multiple levels. It's being misrepresented, but it is an intrinsically bad paper to begin with.
I think it is, including because the whole point of carbon pricing generally and carbon pricing with a CBAM only more so is to inspire change in behaviour and investment so that emissions come down while continuing to do the things we need economies to do. And the model that they've used doesn't allow for that to happen. Like there's nothing that firms can do other than shift production to other countries with fixed carbon intensities of production. So before I go on an extended rant, I'm just going to say, read LinkedIn. So I guess, this is bad, isn't it? My one more thing is my response.
They're buried deep in your one more thing, but yes, you just promoted your own article on LinkedIn.
I hang my head in shame, but not as deeply as the authors of this paper should.
Was this the article that your cat disappeared for you that you had to rewrite?
No.
Okay.
That's another one. My cat is not an agent of the LSE as far as I know. My cat may be an agent of Elon Musk, but I'll say no more about the forthcoming, but already out by the time you listen to this, next article.
Okay. We wait with bated breath. My one more thing is the latest from Irreverent Aussie Energy newsletter, Currently Speaking. It's a Substack, started in early 2023, run not by philosophy professors but by two energy nerds who I think have turned to humour to keep them sane. The article that went up earlier this week grapples with one of the big questions facing Australian energy professionals, which is the correct pronunciation of the acronym or initialism. We can have that conversation. But anyway, how do you say Australian Energy Market Operator in its short form? And I was going to poll both of you. When you're contracting Australian Energy Market Operator, you're mid-flight, you're making a point about the wonderful or nefarious things that organisation is doing. What do you say without saying the four words?
I've only ever heard it said AEMO.
Yeah, so Frankie's AEMO. What are you, Tennant?
AEMO?
Yeah. I didn't think there was as much controversy as there is. Currently Speaking says there is controversy. They got I think, near 1,000-word article out of it. So maybe they have some self-interest in this. But they say that some people say AEMO, some people say AEMO, some people say AEMO, and there are a handful of human beings who say emo, the pronunciation that this newsletter describes as positively deranged. Anyway, I was impressed by the depth of investigation associated with this article, which includes analysis of AEMO corporate videos and audio of the current CEO, Daniel Westerman, past CEO, Audrey Zierman, and even Renew Economy journalist, Giles Parkinson.
The descriptive approach at work. What do ethics tell us about the pronunciation?
That is a question I have no answer for, Tennant. But
will we be able to tell future generations the pronunciation of this agency? Well, was there a consensus that these guys landed on?
Well, I don't want to spoil the article, Frankie. I want to send people to Currently Speaking.
Oh, that's true.
And it is well worth a look. And I reckon if you turn up for our podcast every fortnight, you'll get a kick out of this newsletter. Recommend a subscribe.
Sounds good.
Nice.
that's our show for today. We're on social media. You can come and have a yarn with us on Twitter. You can visit LinkedIn, where you'll find Tennant posting articles about CBAM and Frankie posting birthday cakes from the podcast. That's fun. But if you wanted to speak to us in long form, if you wanted to send us an email, where Tennant should that email be directed to?
mailbag@letmesumup.net, the place of choice for emails about papers, past, present and future.
And Frankie, we have a website. What is it?
We do. It's letmesumup.net. You can find all the golden nuggets of insight and Easter eggs in our back catalogue on there. All of our now 27 episode oeuvre is available. and also, I can't believe I just said that.
I look forward to homages to our oeuvre.
Yes, they're all available there, including the overly long show notes that accompany each episode, as well as a few other bits and pieces. Check it out.
Check it out indeed. For Frankie Muskovich and Tennant Reid, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.